One of the biggest topics in regards to Path of Exile 2's balance during the early access period of the game has been the state of defences. Beginning at the launch of early access at the end of 2024, I think it's fair to say that defences were in a very poor place, and over several patches, GGG have slowly been addressing problem areas when it comes to character defences, such as small improvements to the armour formula and subsequent addition of many modifiers to allow armour to apply to elemental hit damage, or the addition of the deflection mechanic and the improvement to that formula in 0.5, but even with those changes, one defense type has stood head and shoulders above the rest throughout this time, and that is of course Energy Shield. Now I wanted to make this video to review the state of defences in patch 0.5 because realistically we're not that many big interim patches away from the launch of 1.0, which is currently scheduled to be announced at ExileCon later this year with the release by the end of the year. So let's get straight into it, beginning with a bit of a broader overview of what's being played in this patch, because it's important to note straight away that the two most played ascendancies are of course the newly released Martial Artist and Spirit Walker, both of which begin on that right side of the passive tree, and you can see that on the passive tree heat map here, just how many of the logged characters on PoE Ninja are positioned in that section of the tree. This means that naturally there's more of a preference towards hybrid Energy Shield and Evasion setups, with the support being located close by on the tree, and you can see that right here with an incredible 33% or so of all of the level 90 plus characters in softcore trade Runes of Aldur taking Spectral Ward, a node that provides flat Energy Shield from the Evasion rating on your equipped body armour. And even crazier than that is the almost 40% taking Mindful Awareness, because this is a node that's essentially a monk starting area notable, providing evasion and energy shield scaling. And I think even with the popularity of the martial artist in this patch, this just goes to show how efficient the monk starting area is to travel to for a lot of different builds. You can see that here, that even when I exclude the martial artist builds from the data, the next highest played monk ascendancy is the Acolyte of Chaula with just 2% share, and even with that exclusion, almost 24% of builds are venturing to the monk starting area. The reason for this is a combination of evasion and energy shield hybrid defences being a worthwhile defensive layer to invest into, and a superior option to other potential defences, especially on this side of the tree. But it's also the fact that there's a bunch of extremely efficient critical hit scaling clusters on the way, and of course these two notables right here at the start, providing a bunch of attack and cast speed and movement speed on top of other generic useful stats. Honestly, it's kind of crazy to look at just how stacked the monk starting area is compared to other classes. There's just so much power packed into this area. Now, remaining on the topic of evasion energy shield hybrid defences, there has to be a special mention here for the martial artist's Way of the Stonefist, because this node can just turn your gloves into what is essentially a second body armour in terms of the raw defences it provides. However, even just a weak pair of gloves that would usually provide almost nothing defensively, such as the extremely popular Loctonial Caress this patch, are able to grant a very meaningful amount of evasion and energy shield thanks to this node. And this is just one of the many reasons right now setting the martial artist apart from other ascendancy options. And speaking of the martial artist, another key defensive aspect that must be mentioned here is the meta setup of Hollow Form and Whirling Assault, or really just any Hollow Form setup, because this covers such a gigantic area of the screen, which means that monsters have a hard time even getting close to you, which is a really important part of the build that makes it feel so good to play. At the same time, a similar point should be made for the Spirit Walker and the companion-based setup, where minions are able to just often soak up a bunch of the damage instead of your character, and I think that as Path of Exile 2 is developed further, we'll see more and more of a preference towards these types of builds that have access to huge amounts of utility without much investment, because in many cases they can forego a lot of extra defensive scaling due to the nature of the build. Another good example of that this patch is of course Spell Totems, where the playstyle enables much more freedom to move around, so you don't get hit anywhere near as much. Now let's get back to the core defences for a moment, and that preference towards energy shield and evasion, because you can clearly see this in the dominance of spirit gems that benefit this archetype. Wind Dancer is right here at the top with 36%, followed by Charge Regulation at 34% and Ghost Dance also at 34%. These 3 spirit gems make up an extremely strong supporting mechanism for scaling and enabling evasion and energy shield hybrid setups, and one of the most popular builds this league is of course the Hollow Form Whirling Assault Martial Artist, a build that can generate near infinite charges due to the way of the Stonefist interaction with Nocturnal Caress. However, I think the more interesting thing here is the stats when excluding the 2 most played Ascendancies, because even without the Martial Artist and Spirit Walker taken into account, Wind Dancer and Ghost Dance are still making up about 20% of builds this league. Compare that to the other defensive archetype spirit skills such as Scavenge Plating at just 4% or Bark Skin at less than 1%, and you can see the clear preference there for Evasion Energy Shield hybrid setups, which makes sense too considering how powerful the combination of avoidance and actual meaningful hit pool scaling really is in current Path of Exile 2. And do keep in mind that this is after those targeted nerfs to energy shield recovery in patch 0.5. So let's discuss that for a moment, because these changes were attempting to make energy shield into more of a defensive barrier and less of a hit pool extender or even an outright replacement for life. We know from Q&As with GGG that internally they view energy shield as a competitor to armor and evasion, but this simply isn't how energy shield is used in PoE 2. It's used as a life replacement in conjunction with Chaos Inoculation, or an extension of life to ensure that you have enough hit pool to absorb bigger hits, especially considering that it's much harder to scale life with almost no life on the tree, and therefore the alternative is to mix in a bit of energy shield into your build, which is extremely easy to scale in terms of raw hit pool, and it's actually got even easier this league, more on that in a moment. But these nerfs were focused solely on the recovery aspect of energy shield, and the result of these changes is that it's simply more inconvenient now to play energy shield. You still play the exact same way, you're still choosing energy shield over other options because of how much of it you can get, but now you just need to wait a bit longer to recover. It's more annoying, but it's still extremely strong compared to other options. And I think the biggest issue here is still the sheer amount of scaling for maximum energy shield that you can get from so many different sources, and that's the area that they didn't nerf. In fact, it was buffed due to the new Effect of Prefixes modifier that you can now get on jewels, and quality scaling for jewels as well, where you can just obtain ridiculous amounts of energy shield scaling now from your jewels alone. And in the right setup with a Cultivated Adorned, this can be 50% increased maximum energy shield or more from each jewel, which honestly is just silly. But it's just another example of this being completely out of control compared to other options. Now, I did just briefly mention Chaos Inoculation there, and over a month into patch 0.5, this is the most popular keystone in the game by far, on an incredible 25% of level 90 plus builds. In fact, it's much more popular this league compared to 0.4, even with those recovery nerfs. And this feeds into that energy shield scaling problem, because a lot of the strongest builds in the game are gravitating towards this keystone in the endgame once they have good enough gear, because for the most part it's a no-brainer on those setups. Losing a fairly mediocre life pool to obtain chaos damage and bleeding immunity is an easy trade-off to make. A bunch of your suffixes are freed up as you no longer need any chaos resistance at all, which naturally makes solving other resistances and attributes much easier, and on top of that, you also have all 3 prefixes to scale energy shield. Compare that to life builds that need to juggle life and defensive scaling at the same time on those prefixes, and it's easy to see why this keystone is so popular right now in Path of Exile 2. I think at this stage, GGG need to seriously review what energy shield really is and how it's being used, because it's simply not how they've described it in the Q&As. It absolutely is a direct competitor with life, and life is hopelessly losing the battle due to lack of reasonable scaling vectors. Okay, now that was a long segment on energy shield and hybrid defenses, which makes sense considering that's a large majority of the builds in this patch, but I do want to cover some other trends in 0.5. And I wanted to discuss the offhand slot, as there's a few interesting things going on here. Firstly, the Dance with Death keystone has surged in popularity this league, largely due to Twister builds, and this is a keystone that only allows you to use a one-handed weapon with no offhand equipped, but it provides a huge boost to skill speed in return. Now this does mean that these builds lack potential defences from an equipped shield or the utility of a scepter, but they do have a big boost to skill speed, and I think this is an important point here because this is the old adage of the best defense is just to not get hit in the first place, and you can see that in action here. The use of Dance with Death enables these builds to use their skills faster, to complete their twister rotation in less time, therefore dealing damage faster and being able to move sooner, so they're going to be able to avoid incoming damage more often. And this massive uptick in the use of this keystone correlates with the drop-off in the usage of shields in 0.5. This is of course also affected by the most popular builds existing on the right side of the tree, but in builds that do have an opportunity to use a shield, there's a huge preference towards a scepter offhand instead due to the massive utility that it can provide. And I expect this gap will only widen going forward with more competitive Spirit Gem options being added in time. Now another thing to mention in this section of the video is the Gemling Legionnaire, which has slowly climbed the ladder for most played ascendancies, now tied with the Spirit Walker this far into the league. And this class has some interesting ways to scale defences, which allow it to specialise into many different defensive setups depending on the build and location on the tree. This comes from two places, Virtuous Barrier and the extra quality stat from Advanced Thaumaturgy. For example, there are a significant amount of mana stacking Gemlings making use of the extra damage gained from the bonus quality on Archmage, but these builds make extremely good use of the huge amount of mana recovery provided by Virtuous Barrier, allowing them to utilise damage taken from mana before life more effectively. There's also about a fifth of Gemling builds which are leaning into the more meta setup of Evasion and Energy Shield scaling with Wind Dancer and Ghost Dance, and notably Gemling is able to get an extra Ghost Shroud or two from scaling quality, which is really quite powerful. And beyond the more popular options there are also things like Magma Barrier, which for a Gemling grants extra maximum block chance. That's being used by about 5% of Gemling characters. That one is especially strong with Svalin. Now the last thing that I do want to mention in this video is a new feature on PoE Ninja, which is really useful. It's a defensive stat breakdown that allows you to see where defensive stats are actually coming from in a character build, and the impact it's having on things like max hit. This actually works for most stats, not just the defensive stats, so it even works for things like rarity here. You can see the total and the breakdown of where it's coming from, and this is a really nice feature because you can easily find the source of certain stats, and you can also quickly determine the importance of specific gear pieces for certain stats or reaching specific thresholds, so that's a great new feature there. But that pretty much wraps up this video on the current state of defences in Path of Exile 2. It will be interesting to see what kind of balance changes we get in the restart patches on the road to patch 1.0 later this year, as we know that one of their primary focuses for those patches is going to be balance, and that's going to also include things like defences, so I'm looking forward to seeing what changes are going to be made. That's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.